Titus had found it just outside the escape tunnel. It was a handheld digital voice recorder, more than a few years old. Titus had the foresight to clear the room before listening to it. And now, solemnly, silently, he handed it over to Dr. Williams. "What's this?" she asked. "It's trouble," he said, and pressed play. There was a wheezing, some coughing, and after a deep breath, a familiar voice. "If you're hearing this, it means you were finally stupid enough to come back," said the mocking voice of Cindy Jenkins, former federal marshal, former test subject at Blacksite 1, and the architect of its massacre. "I'm glad the day came. He will be so happy. You people have no idea what you did, what you started. This isn't one monster coming for you. You won't understand this, not until it's too late. But Razormouth is a king, the Blood King, and he's got an army behind him. God help you, because no one else can." "Well, what do you make of that, Agent?" she asked Titus. "Not a fucking clue, Director. It is a bit troubling, though, isn't it? Have you alerted Man 2? "Yes, ma'am. Told them to enhance the watch and expand the perimeter." Williams nodded. She needed to be cautious, but she wasn't at all worried. After all, she had Agent Titus and his kill squad, called Murder 2, at her beck and call. They were one of the most elite killing forces in the world, a heavily armed phalanx with a very strong defensive position. With all that on her side, the tape-recorded words of a dead woman meant very little to Dr. Ivy Williams. She asked her second, "Do we have the eyes outside working yet?" And Titus shook his head. "No, the system works. The internal cameras are at about 50%, but the externals have all been destroyed. Man 2, there are only eyes up top right now." Man 2 was the name of Murder 2's backup detail. It was comprised of a sniper trio, a medical team, tech support, and evac specialists in 2 warbirds. They were all set up in the small structure above ground that housed the entrance to Blacksite 1, a series of elevators and stairwells. Titus had called for one of the medics to come down and tend to his injured agents. That little acid-spitting mutant bitch, Vera, had done much more damage than they had thought possible. Some hours passed. Titus led his agents on a total sweep of the facility, top to bottom, room by room, while Dr. Williams revisited her office and her laboratories. Suddenly, Every speaker in Blacksite 1 burst to life. Not just the PAs hidden in the walls, but the walkies on the belts of the agents. Mayday, Mayday, we are under attack. They came up out of the... Help us, Mayday. One of the techs for Man 2 had blasted a broadcast out to every available channel, but it only lasted for a few seconds. And then static filled the air. Titus left 2 agents with the director and scrambled everyone else upstairs to the main hall. Full armor, full auto, full tilt boogie. All of the elevator shafts were sealed, but not the stairwells. The soldiers took a semicircle kneeling position around one of the doors as they watched the wall panel click from green to red as someone entered the security override code. The door popped open, and a blood-soaked woman fell into the room. "Medic?" Titus called, and then he knelt down beside his agent. He knew her. She was one of the snipers. It looked like her gun had been torn from her hand so forcefully that 2 of her fingers had come away with it. "Tell the director," the sniper wheezed. "We're under attack." It sounded like her lungs were filling up with blood. "They came up from the ground. Everyone is dead." "Who did it, Agent?" Titus asked her. He could already see the light fading from her eyes, and frothy, chunky meat started to drip from her nose. "Monsters," the sniper whispered. "An army of monsters." And she died. "Director, did you hear that?" Titus asked. He looked up at one of the interior cameras. "We have a situation." Agent Titus wasn't aware of it, but the Battle of Blacksite 1 was already underway. Drinking whiskey in the kitchen and telling scary stories around the fire. Music, monsters and mayhem, killers, cannibals and cults, fearful fiction and furious fact, tall tales and terrible truths. This is a scary home companion. Agent Monica Vega was a DRO field medic, trained to provide medical assistance under heavy fire in the most dangerous and hostile environments. She wasn't a fighter, but that was about to change. She was examining the dead sniper, a woman she had shared a coffee with not 3 hours earlier, who now seemed to be dissolving slowly from the inside out. Some of the symptoms looked like an Ebola variant, slowly turning the organs and blood vessels into soup. Or, more accurately, chowder. And then she found a bite mark. A cluster of puncture wounds on the back of the sniper's shoulder. The wound was slowly dissolving the flesh around it. Titus pulled Vega to her feet. "Get a gun," he told her. "I'm a medic, sir." "I know who you are. La Curandera, right? The medicine woman? I don't give a fuck. I don't need a medic. I need a soldier. Get a fucking gun." He tossed her medkit and stuck a submachine gun in her hands. What did she mean by monsters? Vega asked him. Don't you know what they used to do here? Titus would have continued, but primary power died, and for a few seconds the place was full dark. Emergency lights kicked in, and the sirens started wailing. Director? Titus asked. I need a sit rep. Tell me what you see. The PA system clicked a few times, but only static. Ivy didn't want to use the overhead system, and instead spoke directly to Titus through his earpiece. Titus, we have incursions on level 7 and level 5. He swore to himself. Level 5 housed the generators, the utilities, the comm systems. It was the nervous system for Blacksite 1. Williams continued. Fall back to the medical wing on 3. There's an escape tunnel there that no one else knows about. We can use that to achieve Exodus. We can't go straight up. That's a negative, Director. I'll send the medic and the wounded with you. No, Titus, we all retreat. All due respect, Director, but the combat theater is my command. We make a stand here. You'll die. You don't see what I'm seeing, Titus. Director, you underestimate our ability. We can take out anyone. This isn't an anyone. It's an anything. Fall back. That's an order. Titus looked around the dimly lit room. His agents were in formation, even the injured. They were missing 2 from his initial entry team, but it was still a solid fucking crew. There was a beeping. The panel next to one of the steel doors flipped from green to red. Someone outside had entered the override code. Incoming, he snapped everyone to attention. It may be one of us. Wait for my word. Beeping from another door. Beeping from another door. And another and another. They all started beeping. There were a total of 8 doors spread out through this grand hallway. And now all of them had been unlocked. The shooting formation shifted, giving them a wider theater. 3 of the agents dropped low under the gun barrels and spiked a series of handheld directional charges into the floor. The size of a grenade, each of them was a mini claymore mine. The doors opened at once, in concert, very slowly. Just a crack. And then the heads came. Taken from the bodies of the members of Man 2. Severed heads were tossed through each door. Titus shot one of the heads, knocking it backward before it exploded. Each of the skulls had been crammed full of those very same shaped charges. And they all went off in rapid succession. They were too distant from the formation to do any substantial damage, especially with the lightweight but very sturdy DRO combat armor they had on. But it did blast dust, smoke, blood, and debris into the air, clouding the already dimly lit room. And only then, when visibility was at 0, did every door swing wide and the shapes start to pour into the great hall. Open fire. If it moves, fucking kill it. The guns chattered in tight, controlled bursts. Every member of Murder 2 was a skilled soldier, an expert killer, a professional in the industry of dealing death. They scoped headshots and center of mass shots as best they could and let loose 1, 2, even 3 bullets at a time, but never losing control. It took almost 30 seconds before the smoke started to part, and one of those shapes lumbered into view. It was a man, sort of, with a sloping flat head and long forearms and fingers that scraped the ground. He was 7 feet tall at the shoulder, easily half a ton of stretch-marked pale belly fat spread over Michelin Man coils of muscle. This thing, stomped towards them. 3-shot bursts peppered his chest, but did not slow him down. Titus shot out both of his eyes, and that didn't slow him down. So they triggered the charges, which took off one of his legs and both of his feet. With a bellow, the behemoth pitched forward. It was wearing a dozen different slings around its chest, each made of leather, each with a strong pouch that carried a precious payload. This behemoth was a war beast, loaded down with smaller soldiers. These tiny mutants, 1 or maybe 2 feet tall, scurried away from the dying war beast like rats from a sinking ship. They disappeared into the smoke with purpose, direction, with an agenda. But there was no time to single them out through the fog and pick them off, because there were already a half dozen more of these war beasts emerging through the smoke, each one laden with tiny mutant soldiers. And they weren't alone. More figures approached. The DRO was beset on all sides by iniquities of the flesh and the tyranny of fallen gods. A stoop-shouldered woman, with a head far too heavy for her neck, came loping towards the formation. Titus sighted her down the barrel of his gun. Her mouth was ringed with needle teeth, dripping beads of sizzling acid. The sides of her neck bulged as her acid glands churned hot. Titus pulled his shot away from her head and put a bullet through the side of her neck. He was really interested to see inside of one of these disgusting things, to find out what made them tick. Well, he found out all right. When the bullet pierced her pulsing neck sac, the mutant woman started to mule and panic. She slapped both of her fingerless hands over the wound, trying to hold it shut. Poison poured down her side, dissolving the scraps of clothing that she wore. She was making a lot of noise, and Titus quickly realized that she was sounding an alarm. It wasn't a language, it wasn't words, it was just organized noise, but she was shouting a warning to the others, even as she started to run headlong towards the DRO agents, who opened fire on her mercilessly. But the other mutants started to fade back away from her. The woman, she tried, she lunged, but the bullets cut her down. She stumbled. She started to fall, already dying, before one of the war beasts appeared, scooping her up with both colossal hands and tossing her body into the midst of the DRO formation. Her neck ruptured. Her poison glands burst and spewed caustic, sizzling goo over half a dozen agents. And as well-trained, as professional, as skilled as they were, when that acid chewed through their armor and touched their flesh, these agents all screamed and cried and desperately tried to slip out of their gear. The formation broke. The tide of mutants rolled in, on them, over them, engulfing them. Titus retreated, his back covered by Vega and a handful of other surviving agents. It was panic shooting, blasting wildly in all directions as Titus followed his memory towards one of the exits. By the time they got to one of those stairwells, the mutants on level 5 had completely doused the lights, killed the sirens, and somehow got the PA system back on. There were grunts and clicks and a damp, saliva-drenched grumbling that filled the hallways. The invading mutants responded to it. They raised their voices, venomous, vestigial voices, in a horrific battle cry. And then there were 9. Titus and his surviving agents double-timed it down the darkened stairwell, intending to rendezvous with Dr. Williams in the med labs on level 3. The 2 agents covering the retreat walked backwards down the cement steps, unloading streams of blue fire from their flamethrowers behind them. They didn't need a victory, just a little breathing room. On the landing for level 2, Titus paused to reload his machine gun. He counted his spare clips on his belt and made sure his boot knife and drop guns were all still in place. Below, the enemy was climbing towards them. Moist footfalls, ragged breath, the high-pitched wheezing of something in between a snorting pig and a laughing loon. The walls were alive. Tiny tiptoes tapping on the inside of air vents, climbing all around them, peering out through the grates, chittering indecipherable messages back and forth like monkeys at treetops. A mutant burst through the wall of fire, head and torso ablaze, and landed in between the 2 flamethrowers. An ugly ape-like mutant, with stubby little legs and massively overdeveloped arms and chest. It had been using one of the dead DRO agents as a shield, jamming a fist right into her ribcage under the armpit and literally wielding the corpse as a physical shield in front of its chest. It tossed the body atop the agent to its left and tore the head off the agent to its right. Titus used his handgun to send a perfectly placed explosive-tipped bullet into the connection where the flamethrower's Kevlar hose met the fuel cell housing. It burst, vaporizing the mutant and both of the dead agents. "Go, go, go," he shouted, and pushed Vega downstairs in front of him. If she wasn't going to help with the killing, the least she could do is break trail and serve as mutant fodder. An injured agent handed Titus one of his belts, a bandolier still heavily loaded with several types of grenades. On the landing for level 3, he had Vega open the door. He stood by the steps, looking down into the darkness. The mad mutants were rounding the next flight down. He could smell them. He could feel little pinpricks of goose flesh on his forearms as his body told him that something unnatural was approaching. He didn't need to see them because he felt them. He yanked the pin from every grenade and tossed the entire belt down the steps. Vega slammed the door shut behind him before the stairwell filled with white phosphorus heat and napalm blood spatter. Dr. Williams was waiting, flanked by her 2 armed escorts. She gave Titus a withering prison yard stare. "Make a stand, huh? Asshole." She typed in her master override code, which effectively sealed the door from being unlocked by anyone else, which still would not give them much time. Vega tried to take a look at one of the wounded agents, who was holding a nasty-looking bite wound on his thigh, closed with an empty bandolier. But Titus pulled her to her feet again. "He's fine. And even if he isn't, there isn't time for the wounded." The mutants were already pounding on the outside of this fortified door. From the sound of it, they had a substantial battering ram. Even with that, it was the mutants already inside that were the immediate threat. The air vents had all been ripped free, and the little ones that had scurried away from the war beasts earlier, the rat-faced creepers, snake-fanged crawlers, and all the little living fragments of broken DNA that had been cast into wisps of gnarly, dank flesh. They were all here. Dozens of them, standing on the floor, crouching on the lab tables, hanging from the ceiling. Many of them held stolen weapons, scalpels and saw blades and makeshift shivs of glass. Many others were weapons themselves. The pounding on the door got louder. The recessed titanium hinges were pulling free of the concrete housing. Titus looked to his boss for guidance. She cut her eyes, just so, and said, "You were right. There isn't time for the wounded." Titus blinked, lids heavy with responsibility. And then he shot one of the wounded agents in her side and the other in his back. He kicked them both down the hall, and the little mutants set upon them in a storm of flashing blade and tooth and claw and chittering madness. Vega was aghast, but Williams and Titus were already running down the hall of medbays and labs, past the screaming agents as they were flayed alive, past the bulk of the mutant horde. Titus was shooting as he ran, and his remaining agents did their best to follow suit, but they all missed more than they hit. They had only made it a few steps before the wounded had crossed over. And now this pack of little mutants was blood-hungry and ready for another course. The hidden door to the escape tunnel was only 300 yards away, just around the bend on the southeastern wall of the facility. The entrance door blasted off the hinges. It squealed as it hit the floor. A group of large, keloid-covered monsters worked with the perfect harmony of a rowing crew in swinging a battering ram the size of a telephone pole, only considerably thicker and divided up in little segments that sort of looked like vertebrae, like the backbone of something older and bigger, something that had never before seen the light of day. But these mighty mutants did not enter the room. They stepped aside. They knelt. They bowed. "Go, go, go," Titus yelled, tearing his eyes away, keeping the straggling band of survivors going around the bend towards an escape tunnel with a door that was no longer hidden. It was standing wide open. The hallway was filled with life, gloriously mutated life, which surged forward. Titus stopped. He turned. He smashed his elbow into Vega's face and then tossed her towards the oncoming swarm. "Sorry, Doc." And then he opened fire into the crowd, even as the little ones started to swarm his legs from behind and pull him to the floor. Vega struggled, but found herself pinned down. A foot-tall thing with withered nubs for arms slithered a slimy prehensile tail around her wrists, holding them fast so that another thing could bind her thumbs together with a bit of sharp wire, as effective as handcuffs. But they did not kill her. In fact, they barely harmed her. She was being trussed up and then pushed to her knees. She was being presented. Hundreds of different creatures were filling the medical wing of Level 3, of every size and shape and color and consistency. No two mutants were identical, but streaks and shades of common mutations ran through the crowd. They all took a knee. Except the ones who had no knees, but even they bowed low. As the king, Razormouth, slowly walked down the hall. Naked, save his scars, the garments of caked mud and congealed blood, and the crown resting upon his head, made of what looked like long, curved fangs, enormous hook teeth, shark-like but reptilian, and of mammoth proportions. Bound together in wire and leather into a king's headdress. His forked tongue lapped at the air hungrily. Riding on his shoulder, like a parrot on the shoulder of a pirate, was a pale, wispy little mutant girl named Vera. Vera had lived her whole life inside these walls until just a few hours ago. She knew every inch of the place better than anyone alive, and she had given the king the keys to his new kingdom. Better still, she had led him to his greatest enemy, the woman who stole his baby from him, the same woman who stole Vera's father from her, Dr. Ivy Williams. King Razormouth walked past his prey and his loyal subjects. He was looking elsewhere now, studying each room as he walked by it, each lab, each bay, each surgical suite. He was looking for his old room, the place where Williams had kept him in a cage, where she had examined him and cut him, where she had threatened to disembowel his baby. So beloved was this king that his people moved with him, staying ever close while still maintaining a respectful distance, and dragging the prisoners along every inch. Williams, Titus, 2 other agents, and Monica Vega. Titus was in the worst condition. He'd fought the hardest and had taken a brutal beating in return. But his head was still held high, his chin up, even if his eyes and his ears were hemorrhaging and filling with blood. The king snarled and hissed, pointing to the room he sought. His subjects called it back to him, each one trying in their own pitiful way to replicate the sound of their king's voice. He pointed to the floor outside of the room, and the prisoners were all dragged forward and placed on their knees looking through the open door. The blood gutters on the floor that the king remembered so clearly. The gurneys and trays full of instruments. The cage in the corner. He shouted something. With his forked tongue, hideously distended jaw and mouth full of razors and glass and broken bone, it was unintelligible. And yet, someone understood it. The crew of bulky, keloid-covered mutants were returning, stepping in perfect time with one another, so that it sounded like one massive beast approaching. They had put aside the battering ram, and now carried something else. A litter. A litter made of discarded wood and steel and adorned with misshapen skulls along the edges. A litter built around a centerpiece of a wheelchair. A wheelchair with a woman sitting in it. Her name was Cindy Jenkins, former federal marshal, former prisoner of Blacksite 1, currently war counsel to the Blood King. The litter she rode, being carried like a queen, had been built into, around, and encompassing her wheelchair, much as her own body had grown into, around, and encompassing said wheelchair. At this point, Cindy was well over a year pregnant. After the brutal attack by the thing in the basement at the asylum in Grace, Michigan, her pregnancy had progressed quickly. And then it had metastasized. Instead of growing and maturing and being born, the fetus had proven to be a parasite, a symbiotic life form that had no inclination towards being born at all. It wanted to stay inside, where it was nice and warm and wet and safe. And it continued to grow, becoming a part of its mama. Cindy's hands and head were ringed in neoclassical-looking halos of yellow cigarette smoke. Most babies fed on nutrients. Hers supped on carcinogens. Dr. Williams, Cindy said. Although her belly was grossly distended, her legs varicose, her breasts sallow and withered, her voice and her mind were as sharp as ever. Vera scrambled over and sat on her lap. He knew that you would come back. I told him you never would. I told him you were too smart to ever come back here. But he was sure of it. Our king. He set the watchman here, and God damn it, he was right. Her carriers gently sat down the litter, but did not move away. They were the personal guard of Cindy Jenkins. Williams, for her part, never said a word and never took her eyes away from Jenkins. She showed zero fear, and only the faintest hint of repulsed contempt on her face. I wish I could tell you he was going to kill you, Ivy. Really, I do. Sister to sister, I urged him to kill you. Show you a bit of mercy and just put all this behind us, you know? She lit a cigarette. But the king has made up his mind. Razormouth stepped in between the two women and knelt down so that he was face to face with Williams. His breath reeked of roadkill and cabbage. The tips of his tongue grazed her cheek. They were dry and rough like a cat's tongue. I am only here to translate for the king. Ordinarily, you would all be getting cooked and eaten by now. But these are special circumstances. Razormouth ran his needle-claw fingertips through William's tightly pulled hair, found purchase, and then dragged her with him into the lab. She was bound to the very same stainless steel torture table that she had bound him to. And then Razormouth perched on top of his old cage, and he squatted down to wait, to watch, as the 4 DRO agents were lined up so that they could all see their boss, as War Counsel Jenkins laid out his offer. It didn't take long. It wasn't a complicated offer. Serve or die. The king demanded an act of loyalty from them, and they had a choice to stand and prove or kneel and die. The first agent tearfully refused. So the massive beast behind him crushed his skull and twisted it around backwards. Even in the face of that act, the second agent could still not accept this offer. And so her head and spinal column met a similar fate. Agent Titus lowered his chin and stared at the floor. He could feel the director's eyes on him, silently imploring him for help, and he did not want to see that. I yield to your king. But I can't do what you're asking. I don't have the skills, do I? But she does. He nodded towards Vega. She's a doctor, nurse, medic, whatever the fuck. She can do it. And I'll help her. Vega shook her head. No, I won't do it. I won't kill her. I can't. I took an oath. I made a vow. Jenkins chuckled. I took one of those. I remember how it used to, mean something. I will not kill her, Vega repeated. They called her La Curandera back in her home village of Piernarota. It was there that she had vowed to the nuns, Las Hermanas Sombra, that she would never intentionally take a life, any life. Jenkins said, well, that's perfect. He wants her to live. In fact, he insists that she live. He just wants her to live without her arms or her legs. And that was the offer, you see. Show loyalty to their new king by performing a field amputation on Dr. Ivy Williams so that she would remain alive and well and without any of her limbs. She will be as helpless as a baby, Jenkins explained. But King Razormouth promises to take good care of her. She will live a very, very long time. Their bonds were removed, and the 2 remaining DRO agents walked into the operating theater. Dr. Vega and Nurse Titus began to apply tourniquets and sterilize the cutting tools. Defiantly, Ivy Williams did not beg for mercy. She did not weep or snivel or cry. She stared at the ceiling, blinking back tears, refusing to give any of them the satisfaction of seeing her suffer. But that didn't last long. As each limb was removed, it was tossed into the hallway as a treat for the little ones. For he was a benevolent king. fallen mutants were all treated with the due reverence that their customs demanded. The fallen humans were nothing but food. However, there were others, many others, that littered the building, too old and rotten to be anything but raw materials. This included not only the piles of the dead that King Razormouth had left in his wake some months earlier during the massacre, but also the storerooms full of corpses that the DRO had left behind when they fled the facility, as well as the living prisoners they had abandoned in their cells with no life support. Some had died of starvation or thirst, but there were entire cell blocks that had been gassed as part of the emergency response system. Hundreds of inedible human corpses filled Blacksite 1 in various levels of toxic decay. The king ordered them all brought outside, dragged to the surface, to the stretch of desert that covered Blacksite 1, where they were arranged in a very certain way. When it was finished, Razormouth scuttled to the top of a heap of the rotting dead, 20 feet high and twice as wide. He sat at the apex, a burial ground of corpses, as his throne, and stared out into the sun-bleached desert. Under the shadow of his crown, he flicked his forked tongue and steepled his needle-claw fingers. In the sand below, all those dozens of festering and emaciated cadavers had been laid out to spell 2 words in letters large enough for all of his enemies to see. Send more. The Blood King gazed upon his conquered land and rejoiced. Thank you for listening to an epic installment of A Scary Home Companion. If you haven't been following along to show storyline since the inception of A Scary Home Companion, you may not know that this episode builds off what began in The Thing in the Basement, continued in Night of the Long Knives, The Massacre at Blacksite 1, and Venom Runs Clear, Blood Runs Black. I hope you enjoyed this installment, but we have only just begun. You can find the show on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Email us directly at ascaryhomecompanion@gmail.com. Subscribe or leave a review on whatever platform you listen to the show on. Or sign up for the Patreon. There's good stuff on the Patreon, folks. And we're putting more exclusive content up every single week. Scripts, analysis videos, new stories that are available only there. The episode was produced and edited by Jeff Davidson, featuring music by John Ojeda and Pathios Productions with Tragic Hero, Midnight Pasta, and Wars Theme. SWANS with No Words, No Thoughts. Chelsea Oxendine with the theme music.